Good afternoon, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ida Walker and welcome back for Day 3 of the Social Cohesion and Inclusion National Conference. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land upon which I stand today and pay our respects to their elders past and present. We had a wonderful panel discussion yesterday where panelists reflected on their experience of being part of a consultative process in the inclusive narrative roundtables held over the past year, and also explored their thoughts on vital areas which need to be advanced in order to foster greater degrees of cohesion in the country, such as in the media, education, and neighbourhood settings. We cannot express sufficient gratitude to the hundreds of people who participated in those roundtable discussions across Australia and whose contributions have enabled a rich narrative to emerge so organically. Not only did the roundtable participants describe a narrative of our past and current reality, but they have written the narrative of the future, the kind of society they envision for generations to come. And from here, we invite you all, by being part of the conference and beyond, to build on the content in this publication and continue to write our future narrative. Now, it is our great pleasure to have a keynote address given by Dr. Anne Ali today. Her address will be followed by an audience Q&A, and we encourage you all to pop your questions in the Q&A box, which you can find an icon for at the bottom of your screen. For the final part of the session, we will go into breakout discussion rooms to meet others who are attending this conference and discuss further the insights and concepts and ideas from Dr. Ali's address. Moderating our session for today is Mr. Anton Jones, who is a member of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of Australia. I will now hand the session over to you, Anton.
Thank you so much, Ida, and it's lovely to be here. What a wonderful opportunity. What a 2020 conference this is, really. You know, having this experience spread over several days and being done in this virtual format. So, of course, in such a time, thinking about social cohesion and the inclusive narrative, this process is it's really timely to hear from our speaker today. We know that this pandemic has affected us at the individual level, it's affected us at the collective level, and you know, as recently as today, we've heard about the lockdown conditions occurring in South Australia. So to all of you joining us from South Australia, our thoughts and prayers are with you, and we hope that those conditions can change quickly and that cluster can be brought under control quickly. Of course, this has an impact. These types of drastic changes in our lives have a significant impact, and this really is the reason for asking our guest speaker along today to share with us some thoughts about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on social cohesion. Now, Dr. Ali will be well known to many of you. She's a well-known public figure in Australia. She's been a member of Parliament since 2016 for the seat of Cowan in Western Australia. After coming to Australia as a 2-year-old, she studied her master's and a PhD at Edith Cowan University, and she's held a number of senior positions within the West Australian Public Service. Dr. Ali may be best known for her work at both Curtin University and Edith Cowan University, with a focus on counter-terrorism and countering violent extremism, and has been an advisor to the United Nations Counter-Terrorism Directorate, a board member of both the Council for Arab-Australian Relations and the Australia-Arab Chamber of Commerce and Industry. She's addressed President Obama's Countering Violent Extremism Summit at the White House, and she's also the founding chair of People Against Violent Extremism, which is a not-for-profit organisation focused on empowering communities to challenge violent extremism. It's our great joy and delight to have her here today. Will you please join me in whatever way you can in warmly welcoming our dear Dr. Anne Ali to speak to us today. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you so much, Anton, for your very warm welcome and that wonderful introduction, and a very warm welcome to everybody who's joining us today. Can I start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, wherever it is that we are meeting? I'm meeting with you from Perth in the northern suburbs, and this is Noongar Whadjuk land. So I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Can I also pay my warm respects and acknowledge the Australian Baha'i community for hosting this very important and timely conference. And that this year, acknowledge also that this year is the centenary of the arrival of the Baha'i faith in Australia. And what a wonderful century it's been with your presence here in Australia, making us all the more richer and all the more wiser for your inclusiveness in our society. I do want to start by one of my favourite quotes from Baha'u'llah, and I know that many of you will be familiar with this quote, but it certainly is a quote that whenever I read this, I feel such light and wisdom in this quote. It's a fairly long one, so please bear with me. Be generous in prosperity and thankful in adversity. Be worthy of the trust of thy neighbour, and look upon him with a bright and friendly face. Be a treasure to the poor, an admonisher to the rich, an answer of the cry of the needy, a preserver of the sanctity of thy pledge. Be fair in thy judgment and guarded in thy speech. Be unjust to no man, and show all meekness to all men. Be as a lamp unto them that walk in darkness, a joy to the sorrowful, a sea for the thirsty, a haven for the distressed, an upholder and defender of the victim of oppression. Let integrity and uprightness distinguish all thine acts. Be a home for a stranger, a balm to the suffering, a tower of strength for the fugitive. Be eyes to the blind and a guiding light unto the feet of the erring. Be an ornament to the countenance of truth, a crown to the brow of fidelity, a pillar of the temple of righteousness, a breath of life to the body of mankind, an ensign of the hosts of justice, a luminary above the horizon of virtue, a dew to the soil of the human heart, an ark on the ocean of knowledge, a sun in the heaven of bounty, a gem on the diadem of wisdom, a shining light in the firmament of thy generation, a fruit upon the tree of humility. There are many reasons why I love that quote, and I find those words surely, for me, a source of comfort and a guiding light in my role as a parliamentarian. But I also think they encapsulate the tenets of the Baha'i faith. And given that the topic of this talk is social cohesion, I think it's an extremely apt quote to start off a discussion about social cohesion. And indeed, when I mentioned to somebody that I was giving a talk on social cohesion to the Baha'i community, they said, well, why does the Baha'i community need that? They are the most socially cohesive community in Australia. And I certainly agree with that. And I think that comes from the very tenets and the words of Baha'u'llah. So I wanted to talk today a bit about what social cohesion means, because I want to move beyond what the popular definition of social cohesion is. And much like we cannot consider peace to just be or merely be the absence of war, so too social cohesion cannot merely be considered the absence of discord or disunity within a society. So I wanted to kind of look at what is social cohesion, both as a concept and in practical terms, and what does it mean for these rather challenging times that we have with COVID-19, given the theme of the conference today. So I don't want to bore you too much with too much academic insight into what social cohesion is. But I do want to start with that because I think that's a way that we can kind of break through different understandings and different conceptions and different misconceptions about what social cohesion is, and move through and break through this kind of idea of social cohesion being merely the absence of disunity disharmony or disruptance within a society, and use social cohesion as something meaningful that can be operationalized for a better society, that can be operationalized during times of crisis, but also throughout society, both for governments and for civil society. So I'm going to start with the idea that in the public conscious, at least, social cohesion is often thought of as a kind of a glue, the kind of glue that holds us together, holds relationships together. And it certainly is about the relationship between individuals, their interactions, their shared goals and their values. But it's also much more than that. In 1998, Jensen published a concept of social cohesion that looked at five dimensions, that kind of elaborated on it. And those 5 dimensions were affiliation and isolation, sharing common values, and a feeling of belonging to a society. The second dimension was insertion and exclusion, which is a shared capacity to participate in the economy, and particularly in the labour market. The third dimension is participation and passivity, the capacity or perceived capacity to be involved in the management of public affairs through the various opportunities and platforms for political participation. The fourth dimension is acceptance rejection, and that is where we see pluralism as a virtue, and we see an acceptance, and beyond acceptance, also respect for difference, different values, different faith systems, different cultural backgrounds, for example. And the fifth dimension is legitimacy and illegitimacy, and that is not just trust between people, but trust in the governing institutions that represent people and their interests. That approach by Jensen in 1998 was developed further by another academic named Bernard in 1999. And he then broadened those dimensions, proposing a kind of a typology of social cohesion that was based around 2 factors. The first factor described 3 spheres or domains of human activities: economic, political and socio-cultural dimensions of activity. And the second factor was related to social relations. And he distinguished between social relations that represent values and attitudes and social relations that are observed behaviours and practices. He then integrated, and he then kind of had an integrated scheme where he defined social cohesion as having 6 components across 3 domains: the values and attitudes of insertion and exclusion, legitimacy and illegitimacy, acceptance and rejection, across economic, political and socio-cultural domains. But he also looks at behaviours and practices, and that's really important, that it's not just about the concept, but the actual implementation, if you like, or the lived experience of that concept through behaviours and practices, the behaviours and practices of equality and inequality, participation and passivity, affiliation and isolation, across those same 3 domains of political, economic and socio-political. So when we look at the broad body of research on social cohesion, and there is a lot of research on social cohesion, we can then start to draw a kind of a broader definition that doesn't just describe social cohesion just as a glue, just as the relationships between individuals and people, just as the absence of disharmony or the absence of disruption, but really look at social cohesion as a mechanism, and a mechanism by which individuals and groups perceive their own capacity to participate in economic, in social and political life of their society, as well as their ability to do that. So when we look at social cohesion in that way, as not just about our relationships with each other, but our relationships with the institutions, our ability to participate, and the opportunities that we have to participate, social cohesion becomes a really central mechanism for the effective functioning of a society, and more importantly, is measurable. It seems that social cohesion is this intangible concept that we know it's there, and we feel when it's not there, but we can't quite describe what it is. Now, if we can think of social cohesion as something that is measurable, that is definable in terms of attitudes and perceptions, as well as actual behaviours, such as economic freedom, labour force participation, political membership, and participation in elections. If we use those kinds of things to measure social cohesion, we can translate social cohesion from this concept that we know exists but can't quite put our finger on to something that is actually measurable, achievable, and transferable and translatable into policy for both government and civil society. I wanted to move on from there to talk about social cohesion during times of crisis. Much of the research that I've done has looked at social cohesion in the context of the fear of terrorism and the fear of crime and what that does, because fear has a number of mobilizers, behavioral mobilizers, that can either be conducive to social cohesion or they can be detrimental to social cohesion. And there's no doubt that in times of crisis, when people are unsettled, when they're uncertain, when the future is uncertain, that fear is very prevalent, whether it's the fear of terrorism or, as we've seen with this 2020 year that's almost over, thank God, the fear of a virus or of some other form of physical harm to oneself or to one's family. Now, my research on the fear of terrorism measured two kinds of behaviour in response to the fear of terrorism, and they were protective and avoidance behaviours. They're behaviours that are also associated with the fear of crime. And a protective behaviour means that people will keep on doing what they were doing, but they'll undertake some extra measures to ensure that they feel safe doing those things. So, for example, in response to the fear of crime, you might, for example, still go out at night, but have a friend escort you to your car at the end of the night. Avoidance behaviours are different. Avoidance behaviours means that people completely avoid doing anything associated with that fear. So they stop what they're doing altogether to ensure their safety. They avoid crowded places. They stop going out to major events, for example. And from this kind of research into the fear of terrorism, fear of crime, and what fear does to people and how people respond to fear, there's also a whole body of literature that looks at social disorganisation and looking at things like, sorry, I must put my phone on silent, please excuse me, looking at things like neighbourhood characteristics, disadvantage, population stability or mobility, racial and ethnic diversity, and looking at how crime levels and those neighbourhood characteristics shape collective efficacy and inform beliefs about crime, about violence, and other forms of fear-inducing phenomenon. The implication to all of this is that while characteristics, neighbourhood characteristics, demographic characteristics, have a bearing on the levels of fear, and particularly the levels of the fear of crime, there is a correlation between the perception of crime, the fear of terrorism, the fear of being physically harmed, whether it's through terrorism or through a virus, and social cohesion. And that correlation that we have, the relationship between fear and social cohesion, can be described as either fear decline or fear solidarity. Fear decline happens when fear weakens the ability of local communities to act collectively, to address those issues, because it becomes an inhibitor. right? So you think about this. Think about when you're afraid of something. There's two things that you do. You either run or you freeze, right? So fear decline happens when you freeze and there's no action is taken. At the community level, fear decline means that the community itself becomes stymied in undertaking any kind of response to issues that are inducing fear. And social interactions disintegrate and social cohesion also disintegrates. Fear solidarity is the opposite of that. Fear solidarity happens when fear of a particular issue, such as crime or physical harm, actually confirms community solidarity and motivates collective action. It motivates people to reach out to each other. It motivates people to contact each other. It increases trust between individuals and between the institutions that govern them. And it mobilizes people to search for shared values in response to that fear. Fear decline and fear solidarity are two very, very different responses to crisis. I think during COVID-19, we've been extremely lucky and fortunate in Australia that the predominant response that we've seen is a fear solidarity response. We've seen people come together. We've seen people follow the health advice and undertake protective measures and avoidance behaviours, not just for themselves, but to protect their fellow Australians, to ensure that the virus doesn't spread. We also saw that during the bushfires when we saw communities come together. And that's the real positive that we take out of times of crisis, is that if fear solidarity is the dominant response, then it provides us an opportunity to build social cohesion through coming together, through connecting with each other, through finding shared values, and through building those threads of trust and solidarity that make up the fabric of our society. So how do we leverage this? How do we leverage social cohesion in times of crisis? The kinds of social cohesion that we saw during the bushfire crisis, the positive social cohesion that we saw during and the current pandemic that we've seen, even though we've had pockets of kind of a negative response, that kind of, but predominantly that fear solidarity and that social cohesion. To some extent, in fact, to a very large extent, there is a political capital in keeping people in a state of fear. And through time immemorial, governments have used fear to control the population. But governing by fear and division is not sustainable. It's much, much more beneficial in the long term, as well as the medium term, to govern through solidarity and by promoting solidarity and promoting unity. Governments can utilise and create the policy settings that allow for civil society to activate the kinds of tools that bring people together, that promote social cohesion, that promote fear solidarity in times of crisis, but where there is no crisis, to keep those kinds of elements of shared values and common goals as part of the fabric of social society. They can do this by creating policy settings that eliminate discrimination and substantive barriers to the full economic participation for all people. We know that in countries where people are afforded the capacity, the ability and the opportunity for full economic participation, for example, there is much less prevalence of terrorism and violence. So there are measurable benefits that aren't just economic benefits. We often talk about the economic benefits of social cohesion, the economic benefits of participation, but there are benefits that go beyond economics as well. So social cohesion offers us a framework for understanding and enacting much more than just a relationship between people and groups within communities. It can actually be applied at the national level across domains of economic, social, and political attitudes and behaviours. And we see that in the literature, in the research, kind of at a theoretical academic level. But when we drill that down to practical level, what we're really talking about is how people come together in times of crisis and how we can harness that to keep that going, so that social cohesion isn't just the absence of disharmony. I want to end with perhaps some questions. Some questions that we can use to talk further about social cohesion, some questions that we can use to turn the mirror on ourselves and measure our own society in terms of how well we are doing on social cohesion. And briefly before I do that, I do want to refer to the concept and the framework of social cohesion that's used by the OECD Development Centre, who in its 2012 edition of the Perspectives on Global Development, Social Cohesion in a Shifting World, they describe a cohesive society as one which, quote, works towards the well-being of all its members, fights exclusion and marginalisation, creates a sense of belonging, promotes trust, and offers its members the opportunity of upward social mobility. I think we can all agree that that's the kind of society that we all want to work towards. We want to work towards an Australia where everybody is looked after. We want to work towards an Australia where nobody is excluded or marginalised, a nation that creates a sense of belonging, a nation that promotes trust between individuals, a nation that offers all its citizens the opportunity to be upwardly mobile, upwardly socially mobile. And the OECD report argues that policymaking must do more than treat diverse issues such as tax reform or social housing through targeted approaches. It should also consider broader social cohesion objectives through an inclusive growth approach that ensures both sustainable development and social cohesion. In other words, social cohesion is often seen as this kind of siloed policy portfolio area. But in fact, social cohesion should be the underlying philosophy of all our policy areas, whether they are economic or social policies. Our aim should be a socially cohesive society using the definition, the OECD definition that I've just read to you, to ensure that all our policies are contributing towards that vision of a socially cohesive society, which is beyond just a society that is not disrupted or a society that is not divided, but a society in which everyone can flourish and everybody has opportunities. So the different frameworks that I mentioned earlier about social cohesion, if we look across those three areas of economic, political, and socio-political participation, we really look at three kinds of areas of social capital, social mobility, and social trust. That's how I like to look at social cohesion. It's about social capital, social mobility, and social trust. So I'm going to finish off by posing some questions around each of those. And for the first one, I want to talk about social capital. Social capital refers to values, being valued and bonding in society. So all of those concepts of belonging, all of those concepts of inclusion, that's part of social capital. And the questions that we relate to those are questions like, do the policies that we have empower people to feel included and empower them to contribute? Do they speak to the concerns of the Australian population? Do they make people feel like they're being heard? Do they address global issues of concern? Do they engender a feeling of pride in being Australian? And do they reflect the aspirations of Australians? Social mobility is the capacity of individuals to improve those socioeconomic status. Now, I was born in Egypt and come from a fairly low to middle class family. In countries like Egypt, social mobility is incredibly difficult. One's social station is passed on from one's parents, and it becomes incredibly difficult to move above that station. But social mobility is a core tenet of social cohesion. Anyone who's migrated to Australia will tell you that they came here for their children. They'll tell you that they came here for a better opportunity for their children. And isn't that what we all want? Don't we all want our children to have more than what we had? Don't we all want our children to have more opportunities than we had, to have a better life than we had? And that is exactly what social mobility is. Some questions around that. Do our policies present opportunities for individuals to improve themselves and their families? Do they present opportunities for employment? Do they present an optimistic future, a secure future for generations? Do they address issues of discrimination, of equal opportunity? And do they create better access to education, better access to employment? And the third and final sphere here is social trust. And that refers to the level of trust that individuals have towards, not just towards each other, which is often what social cohesion is seen as, that fabric, that glue between people, but that they have towards the institutions that govern them. And this is a really important one, and I believe possibly the most challenging of them all, because this really refers to the trust that people have in their government. We know that trust in government is at an all-time low in Australia, trust in the democratic process, confidence in the education system, confidence in law enforcement, confidence in the legal process, confidence that justice will prevail. Do Australians feel safe and secure? And are the policies that we make inclusive of all Australians? So I hope I've given you some different ideas about what social cohesion means that I think are really useful to apply, not just in a time of crisis, but moving beyond crisis as well, for a better country, a better society, a better nation, that we can all have a part in making better, that we all have a part in playing as part of that social cohesion, whether it's in politics or whether it's through economic participation, whether it's in the ways in which we raise our families. We all have a part to play in ensuring that all of these principles of social cohesion are meaningful in some way. I want to finish with another one of my favourite quotes from Baha'u'llah, and it's a short one this time, and that is that the earth is but one country and mankind its citizens. And indeed, if we view the earth as one country, if we see ourselves all as citizens of the earth, citizens of that country, I think this is where we find so much more in common than what we find our differences, than where our differences are. I think that's the starting point. That's the starting point for social cohesion, is to see us all as equal citizens of a world that goes beyond national borders, that goes beyond the kinds of differences of race, the differences of religion, the differences of social status or economic status. And this is what I think attracts me the most to the Baha'i faith, is this central tenet of the equality of all of mankind, the central tenet of shared values of all of mankind and womankind. And I think that, when we talk about social cohesion, there can be no better place to start than right there, that the earth is but one country and mankind its citizens. So thank you for listening to me today, and I look forward to some of your questions. Thank you. Back to you, Anton.
Wonderful, thank you so much, and that was really actually quite inspiring. I'm sitting here with goosebumps. It was really lovely. In fact, the quote that you read right at the very beginning is actually my favourite quote. I have it on the wall, up on the wall. It's a wonderful way to start, and of course, the one that you finished with is a very powerful one, as you've indicated. In fact, and you said. Talk about social cohesion, the notions of equality of men and women, of course, another really important and critical thing. We have a number of questions, and so I'll do my best to sort of capture some of them. Some of them are quite similar. One of the things that I particularly enjoyed in your presentation was this notion that social cohesion is more than just the absence of social antipathy. It's not just, oh well, we don't hate each other, so therefore we have social cohesion. It's just like, peace is more than the absence of war, and love is more than the absence of hate. So that it's an active thing. I found that particularly insightful, really interesting. It's an act, it's a mechanism, you were saying, which was really very interesting. It seems that there's probably three categories of questions that we've been asked. One seemed to relate to the role of institutions, whether that is government, universities, the academy, notions of the media, in particular current approaches to the media, partisanship within the media, notions of social media and its and commercial influences and those sorts of things. The role that that might play in social cohesion is one. Another is to do with, is there something particular about Australia? I mean, you mentioned the notion of that social mobility is very much achievable in Australia. One of the reasons why many people from overseas come here. But then there's this other idea that maybe we could start with, which is that there are perhaps different levels of social cohesion that we can achieve. So one of the questions here talks about the fact that at the most basic level, for a society to function smoothly, there needs to be a basic level of social cohesion between its members. And I think you talked about that in the context of fear decline versus fear
solidarity.
Fear solidarity. Thank you. That was on my other page. Too many notes written down here. So your remarks focus on the need to move beyond seeing social cohesion as merely the absence of discord or disharmony, as we've mentioned, and learning to see it at higher and higher levels. How do you think the current pandemic is increasingly helping people see the need for higher levels of social cohesion, perhaps beyond the pandemic?
Thank you. I think that I think we're all kind of waiting for the end of 2020, and at some point we're going to look back on 2020. And even now, we're talking about the lessons that we've learned from COVID-19 and the ways in which it's going to change us forever. I'm not so sure that it's going to change us forever, and I'm not so sure that it's heralded these mighty changes in the ways in which we do things and the ways in which we are. I think what it has done is given us a looking glass into what could be. Right? A looking glass of what could be. And I mentioned that what we saw with the bushfire crisis and what we've seen predominantly with COVID-19 is the fear solidarity response, where we saw people aren't putting on masks or social distancing or isolating just because they're told to. Right? They're doing that because there is an altruism behind that means that they are doing that because they feel a connection to other Australians and they feel a responsibility to the well-being of other Australians and to Australian society as a whole. That's really telling. That's really important. It's also really heartening that is the response that we're seeing predominantly from Australia, because that, for the large part, by and large, has contributed to our success in tackling COVID compared to some other nations. But it also means that if ever we doubted that there was social cohesion in Australia, we don't need to doubt that anymore. Because without social cohesion to begin with, without some level of social cohesion to begin with, this is not the response that we would have seen to the crisis. We would have seen a different response. We would have seen the opposite response. We would have seen a response where people stopped talking to each other. We would have seen a response where where fear paralyzed people. Right? And sure, we saw a little bit of that with people hoarding toilet paper and whatever, silly things. But by and large, it didn't define our response to the crisis. So, what we can take away from that, I think, is first of all the fact that we started from a good point. We started from a good point because without social cohesion, we wouldn't have had this. We would have had a different response. But the second thing is we've got something to build on here. We've got something to build on. What the crisis has done has shed a light on the better angels of the Australian character. It's something that we should be incredibly proud of, and it's something that we should also guard and treasure and seek to develop even further in, for example, the ways in which we deal with socioeconomic difference or socioeconomic issues, the ways in which we might look at homelessness, for example, the ways in which we might look at or deal with issues for our First Nations. We've got a model here. And if there is one thing that I hope does kind of last from this crisis, I know that people are saying, oh, it's great, we can all work from home now. Yeah, that's great if that lasts too, I'm sure. But if there's one thing that I hope can last from this crisis, it is that sense of caring for each other that we have seen. I hope that answers the question.
Oh, very much so. Thank you. I think. I mean, you covered a couple of really important points in terms of sort of those protagonists in society. The notion of how we do things collectively and how that responded. But you also mentioned that notion that each of us individually took some responsibility here.
We did.
And to look after others, and we saw that a lot, didn't we? Especially in the early days, about when it seemed that it was those who were older or who had pre-existing health conditions who were most vulnerable. Those who were younger and healthier really took it upon themselves to act in ways which looked after them, which I agree is a really encouraging sign. I wonder if you could just at the end of your presentation, you touched on this notion of trust in institutions, and this is sort of the third protagonist in society, and I wonder whether you might just expand. Obviously, you serve one of those institutions in the Australian Parliament, but I'm wondering whether you could just expand a little bit on the notion of the role of institutions, particularly in creating an inclusive narrative for the society. So the social cohesion is one thing, but the stories we tell ourselves, the notion of who we are as a people, and how we're progressing, particularly out of an experience like this. I wonder if you could just, again, from your experience, just expand a little bit on that.
Look, very much so. I think that the institutions have a huge role to play. I think you mentioned the media earlier. And in a modern kind of media landscape where you can have fake news, misinformation, disinformation, where you have what we call echo chambers, where people only consume the kind of media that reaffirms their worldview, there is such a huge potential for division and disharmony and discord as people kind of silo themselves into these echo chambers and only listen to and only reinforce their own ideas. And I think that's really stark in places like the US. I mean, I remember during election night, I was watching CNN, and then I flicked over to Fox. No, it was after the first debate. I was watching CNN, then I flicked over to Fox. And it was like I was watching two completely different takes on exactly the same debate. And it really gave me an insight into the media landscape in the US and why there is so much division in the US along political lines. But it didn't it might have started out as division along political lines, but then it became division along lines of race, along lines of religion, along lines of socioeconomic status. And it really is a lesson in the fact that we should be cautious and we should be conscious of how those narratives can really split people because you have two narratives that never ever kind of crisscross or meet. You know, I think it's really important that we take time to listen to those who are different to us. We take time to talk to people who are different to us. I remember meeting a Republican, a former Republican senator who had come to Canberra, and she was actually the first African American Republican senator. And she said that I ended up having lunch with her because I just found her fascinating, because she said that the Democrats would always say to her, "Why are you a Republican? You're an African American woman. Why are you a Republican? How could you possibly be a Republican?" And I said to her, "Well, tell me why," because I'm from the progressive side of politics. I said, "Tell me why." And she said, "Well, my parents," speaking of herself, she said that her parents had come from Haiti, and that in Haiti they had no freedom, no agency, no individual choice. So when they finally went to the US, that's what they looked for, and they really treasured individual choice and agency and small government. And it really gave me an insight into the fact that, you know, people who we think should be politically progressive aren't necessarily so, because they have their own take on what a politically progressive party looks like. The role of institutions here is very, very, very critical. And when I say institutions, I mean our education institutes. I mean institutions. I mean our political institutions, and I mean our media institutions. Really, really critical in bringing together people, not just in the narratives, but I think also in the representation. Right? So my role as a parliamentarian is to represent my community here. I've got to think, am I representative of my community? You know, it's not just enough to be representative of them, I also have to represent them. Currently in Parliament, we don't have the level of diversity that we see in the Australian population. We don't have the level of diversity, and I'm not talking about cultural diversity or religious diversity. I'm talking about all forms of diversity. I'm not talking about gender diversity. I'm talking about, you know, background. 75% of parliamentarians have a law degree, are lawyers. I don't have anything against lawyers, but we don't need 75% lawyers in the parliament. You know, I'd like to see someone, you know, some people with some different backgrounds getting in there. That'd be really, really good. So yes, while we have institutions have an obligation to do that through the narrative that we speak, the ways in which we speak, and our policies, indeed our policies, and that's what I was saying about social cohesion not being a specific kind of policy aim, but a framework that underpins all policy aims, because it has an ultimate goal of an inclusive society. So we shouldn't just do that through our narrative. We should also do that through our policy, and we should also do that through our own representation of who we are. Who we are should be who all of you are.
Well, Anne, I could keep asking you questions for an hour. We don't have time, unfortunately, but it's really been delightful to have you along and to hear that perspective. I think just so timely. And this notion of diversity of voices, I think, is one that is just so strongly felt and so important. I think it's such an important point that you make, that this diversity of voices is what really gives us the richness of our communities, and as you say, does enhance that social cohesion. Is an important. We all have an important role to allow for that diversity. So, thank you so very much for your presentation today and answering those questions. I believe now our dear Ida will take back over, and we'll go into some breakout rooms. But thank you so much again.
Thank you, Anton. Thank you, Ida, and thank you to everyone.
Thank you, dear Anna-Lee, for your wonderful keynote address, and thank you, Anton Jones, for doing a fabulous job moderating the Q&A. So friends, now we will make the transition from our plenary to our breakout discussions. And the purpose of these discussions is to identify the ideas and insights shared in Dr. Ali's address which can shape steps and actions forward to foster higher levels of cohesion and to learn to build these vibrant and resilient communities in times of prosperity, but also in times of crisis. We encourage you all to join the discussion and consult, support one another, listen to each other, and learn from each other as well. There will be a facilitator to support your group and encourage an equitable discussion in your breakout room also. Thank you and have a wonderful afternoon. We'll see you there.